Season 1 of the standalone prequel to Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, has often been compared to the first season of Game of Thrones, which ran for 8 seasons from 2011 to 2019, despite the fact that House of the Dragon succeeded quickly. In this video, we're going to compare and contrast several aspects of the first season of both series in an attempt to state which is better. Which is better, Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon's first season? Game of Thrones Season 1 debuted in 2011 and marked the beginning of the cinematic adaptation of George R.R. Martin's universe, while House of the Dragon Season 1 returns there 11 years later. HBO produces 10-episode seasons of House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones. Both fantasy drama series are set in the same made-up universes of Westeros and Essos. Additionally, A Song of Ice and Fire and Fire and Blood are both adaptations of George R.R. Martin's books. The two series are distinct from one another, even though they are both set in the same universe and belong to the same franchise. In actuality, House of the Dragon is set precisely 172 years before the birth of Danaerys Targaryen, one of the Game of Thrones characters, according to the first episode of the prequel. It also takes place roughly 200 years before the events depicted in Game of Thrones. Both shows are set in Westeros, but while Game of Thrones is after various story arcs that span across different families as they engage in a series of political conflicts for control of the Iron Throne and consequently the Seven Kingdoms, House of the Dragon offers a narrower focus on the Targaryen family and the beginning of their demise. The cast and characters of House of the Dragon Season 1 versus those of Game of Thrones Season 1. A large ensemble cast, including both up-and-coming and seasoned performers, is present in both House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones. For the prequel series, this cast includes Matt Smith, Paddy Considine, and Olivia Cook. For the original series, it includes Sean Bean, Peter Dinklage, and Lena Headey. As shown in Game of Thrones and the characters for the prequel, House of the Dragon, both initial seasons include excellent acting and interesting, well-rounded characters. The inclusion of gray characters, the majority of whom are not fully villains or entirely heroes, is one of the strengths of both House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, along with their stellar cast. While this does not occur in Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon has an astounding number of character recasts throughout the course of the season, which has drawn some criticism for the prequel's frequent switching of the actors that play several key characters. Comparison of the stories of House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones Season 1. Despite the fact that Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon are two completely different shows, their first season stories appear to be similar. The death of the current monarch, in both cases Viserys Targaryen in House of the Dragon and Robert Baratheon in Game of Thrones, sparks a war over succession. In both shows, questions are raised about the authenticity and family background of the heirs to the throne, the sons of Rhaenyra, the late king's daughter, on one side, and Robert's wife Cersei on the other side. Both of them also share the same problems, with the first several episodes acting as a setup, yet slowing down the pace of the plot, while House of the Dragon has fewer characters and plots to develop, and may result in a less complex storyline for the audience to follow. The first season of Game of Thrones is perhaps more successful in setting up its numerous characters and story arcs, while making its audience care about them. This is because they all come with high stakes for the involved characters. The world building in House of the Dragon Season 1 versus that in Game of Thrones Season 1. House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones are very different from one another in that the former is situated in a much more limited framework than the latter. Essentially a larger universe than that shown in House of the Dragon is what Game of Thrones needs to contend with. Basically, Game of Thrones is used as the basis for a large portion of the world building that House of the Dragon appears to rely on. The original series establishes the relationships between the many families and positions within the court, in addition to the geography of Westeros and Essos, where the events are located. House of the Dragon, on the other hand, contributes to this world building by going into greater detail about the background and customs of the Targaryen family, as well as the elements connected to them, such as the dragons and High Valyrian, all of which were not as thoroughly explored in Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones Season 1 action and CGI versus that of House of the Dragon. It's true that House of the Dragon has a significantly larger budget of nearly $20 million than Game of Thrones Season 1, which had a budget of about $6 million for each episode at the start of the show. It follows that the CGI in the prequel is generally more amazing, as shown by the dragons. Although viewers did see dragons in the Season 1 finale, dragons appear in every episode of House of the Dragon. In comparison to Game of Thrones, there are not only a lot more, but they are also larger and much easier to discern from one another. King's Landing and other well-known locations from Game of Thrones Season 1 make appearances in House of the Dragon, however, in a more improved and updated way. House of the Dragon also appears to be the better series in terms of action. While the majority of Game of Thrones Season 1 concentrates on political problems, the early episodes of the season of House of the Dragon already feature dragon battles and confrontations. Why is House of the Dragon better than Game of Thrones? Game of Thrones may have been the more innovative offering, but House of the Dragon could rely on a loyal following and a well-established cinematic universe. Therefore, it is difficult to conclude which series is superior overall, even though both offer a captivating tale given by a strong cast, writing, and directorial team. While each show has its strengths, Game of Thrones' first season laying the groundwork for following seasons, while House of the Dragon has stunning visuals and top-notch CGI. House of the Dragon's first season ultimately has a quality that Game of Thrones lacks, making it the superior of the two shows. The level of and nudity in Game of Thrones has drawn a lot of criticism, especially in the first season when the plot did not call for such scenes. Contrarily, the contentious parts in House of the Dragon that feature violence and nudity are justified by the story and enhance the audience's appeal of the program as a whole. Next up, which Game of Thrones characters are alive during House of the Dragon? The first season of HBO's House of the Dragon takes place at the Great Council of 101 AC, which determines who will succeed the Iron Throne, 200 years before the Game of Thrones events. Despite the fact that none of the original characters saw the Dance of the Dragons firsthand, House of the Dragon vividly recreates the storied height of House Targaryen's dynastic dynasty and their tragic civil war. Before Daenerys Targaryen, Jon Snow, Tyrion Lannister, and even Maester Aemon were born, the tales of the Targaryen civil war in House of the Dragon, which is where Game of Thrones takes place, had been passed down for a number of centuries. Even though House of the Dragon takes place a very long time before Game of Thrones, one notable character is already living. Although the prequel series House of the Dragon takes place centuries before the Game of Thrones television series, one character is astonishingly still alive. Lady Melisandre, sometimes known as the Red Woman, is one of the Game of Thrones characters who is present during House of the Dragon. David Benioff, the showrunner of Game of Thrones, referred to Melisandre as many centuries old when she removed her necklace and revealed her true identity in Season 6. Actress Karis Van Houten said her character Melisandre in Game of Thrones Season 2 was 400 years old, according to actor Oliver Ford Davies, who played Maester Crescent. In the prequel series storyline, Melisandre was barely halfway through her life because House of the Dragon takes place about 200 years before Game of Thrones. Melisandre, who was presumably still in Essos at the time, is unlikely to show up in House of the Dragon. Melisandre was barely halfway through her life during the prequel series storyline. Melisandre, on the other hand, is unlikely to make an appearance in House of the Dragon because, at the time, she was probably still in Essos. The three-eyed raven, who is thought to be Brynden Rivers from Game of Thrones, comes next and is the one who is closest to having been alive during House of the Dragon. The show never confirmed his identity. The prequel series won't feature the original three-eyed raven because he was born some 40 years after the Dance of the Dragons. There you go. House of the Dragon's first season is considered to be better than that of Game of Thrones. What other shows do you want us to discuss? Inform us in the comments section. Please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks for watching.